One of the first things we have to do is safely raise and support our vehicle so the front wheels are off the ground. After that, we're going to remove all of our lug nuts and then remove the wheel. Now that the wheel's off, we have a nice clear view of our caliper. We want to remove both of our mounting slider bolts here. With both of those loose, let's remove the caliper. Now we're going to hang this so we're putting no pressure on our flex hose. Remove your rotor. Now let's remove our center nut. Remove your washer. With the axle nut off of there, we're going to continue on to coming in the center here with a punch. And just make sure that the axle breaks free from the wheel bearing. If you need to use some penetrant, go ahead and spray some in there. Once it's broken free, we're going to continue on to moving to relieving the outer tie rod end from the knuckle. Now let's move along to removing our outer tie rod end from our knuckle. Let's get the cotter pin out of the way. When you go to break your tie rod free, use a hammer right along the knuckle right here. Now we're going to move along to removing the upper ball joint nut. Of course, we're going to remove the cotter pin as well first. Remove that nut. I'm just going to leave it so it's just barely on there. And now let's move along to the lower ball joint nut. Let's leave this on a couple threads as well, and then we'll start breaking the ball joints free. Let's remove our ABS wire from up here. Now let's follow the ABS wire up along the frame, remove the mounting point right here. Now we'll relieve the electrical connector, pull that off of there, and then remove this from the frame. Bring this all the way down and bring it to where your wheel bearing is. Let's use a little bit of penetrant. Now we don't want to damage the upper ball joint by using a pickle fork to remove it, so I'm just going to use my hammer and bonk right along this area right here. The vibration is going to help set this free. We can let this up. Now we're going to do the same for the lower, right along this area here. Just double check to make sure your ball joint nut is on there a couple good threads. That way there, when the knuckle breaks free, it's going to be caught by the nut. Let's carefully lower this down. We're going to try to pull the axle out of the wheel bearing at the same time. Give this a nice wiggle. Slide the axle out and remove the knuckle. Now I want to get the axle out of the way so we can work on our lower ball joint. I'm just going to lift up on this, slide it up and over there, and that's going to hold it for me. Now let's get our ball joint press. So I'm just going to grab one of the adapters for the ball joint press, and as you notice, it doesn't have a lip to grab onto here, so as we try to apply a little bit of pressure, it's just going to kind of kink off to the side and cause damage. What I'm going to do instead, just use my hammer and give this a couple loving bonks. Now if you wanted to, before you remove the lower ball joint, you can of course remove the grease fitting or just break it off. There it is, friends. Now it's time to install our brand new lower ball joint. Before we install it, let's prep it first. Remove your nut. Now we're going to carefully remove our boot. If you just go right in between this area here, once you get it in, just go ahead and pry it off. You want to be careful not to damage the boot because of course we're going to be reusing it. Now at this point we can get over to the truck and start installing it. I'm going to line this up so the hole for the cotter pin is front to back. Now I'm going to take my cup adapters, come right along here, and we just want to get along the edge of the ball joint. You don't want to go up along the ball area here. So put this up, comes to the edge. Now I'm going to take an adapter that has a hole along the bottom here. Put that up on the top. We can start pressing this in. Okay, so once you have your ball joint so it's completely bottomed out with your lower control arm, keep the tension on it and give it a couple more loving bonks with your hammer. The reason why I'm doing that is because the vibration is going to help ensure that it's set all the way around. Once you have it completely secured, remove your apparatus. Now is going to be time to put on our boot. Something that I like to mention is if you wanted to, you could add a little bit more grease to this area. Obviously it has grease in the ball joint, but it's a non-greasable ball joint, so now's the time to add some if you wanted to. The next thing I want to do is go ahead and put the boot up on here. Typically it should slide right on. If it doesn't, you can try using some pliers and just carefully give it a little squeeze until it does. Just be very careful not to put any pinches or pokes into the boot. Let's get our axle back down here. Now we're going to grab our ball joint, pull it like this. Now we'll grab our knuckle and we'll start putting it on the axle at the same time as the ball joint. Put that on there, let's start our nut. Snug it up. Slide this up and put the axle into the wheel bearing so it's coming out. Come up along here. We're going to start our upper ball joint in. Put your nut on there. Let's go ahead and bottom out our upper ball joint. Now the torque for this is going to be 61 foot-pounds. As you can tell, there's minimal space for a torque wrench and a socket in here. So I'm just going to go ahead and tighten it up by my wrench. So essentially I'm going to bottom it out like it is right here. We'll give it a little bit more, and then we want to pay attention to the slots that are on the nut. You're also going to have a little hole that's inside the stud for the ball joint. You want to line those up. If it doesn't line up, just continue tightening until the very next one does. Slide our cotter pin through there, and of course lock it down. Now we'll torque the lower to 79 foot-pounds. Once again with the slots and the hole in the ball joint. Line them up. If it's not lined up yet, continue tightening until the very next one does. Let's put our bolt up in there, get our ABS wire so it's re-secured. Put this on and we'll snug it up. We'll snug this up and then we'll torque it to 17 foot-pounds. Let's get our ABS wire back on here. Got our bolt hole. Start your bolt in there. Now let's connect this in. Give it a little click and then give it a tug. You want to ensure that this is clipped. If not, you'll get an ABS light. Go ahead and connect it in right here so it's secure to the frame. Now we're going to put the rotor on. Before we can do that though, you want to pay attention to this area right here and then the mating surface that's on the wheel bearing itself. You can tell that this one's in poor condition. It's got a lot of raised areas. We need to clean this down so it's nice and smooth. Now that we have that nice and clean, let's go ahead and put our rotor on. I'm just going to start one of my lug nuts on here so the rotor can't move around. Go ahead and pull out your sliders. Add a little bit of lubricant to them if you have some. Put that back in there. Do the same to both. Now we're just going to slide the caliper over the rotor here. Once the caliper's on, we'll just go ahead and start these in. We'll snug them up. That one's started. Do the same to the other one. Once these are bottomed out, we'll torque them to 38 foot-pounds. Now let's get our outer tie rod back in. Get the nut on here. We'll snug it up and then torque it to 40 foot-pounds. Now once again, of course, we want to line up our slots with the hole on our tie rod. If it doesn't, just continue tightening until the next one does, and then put in your locking cotter pin. Now let's get our washer back on the axle here. Before we put on the nut, just use a little bit of red thread locker, especially if you're not replacing your nut. If you're replacing it, you don't necessarily need to use thread locker. Now at this point, you just want to bottom this out, and then we'll get it down closer to the ground, and we'll torque it to 165 foot-pounds. Now that I have that bottomed out, let's just go ahead and remove this lug nut. Now let's grab our wheel and start it on there. Start on all your lug nuts, bottom them out. We'll get this back down on the ground, and then we'll torque them. With the wheel safely on the ground, let's continue on by torquing our axle nut to 165 foot-pounds. Now let's torque our lug nuts to 140 foot-pounds. Torqued. Of course, if you have your cover, make sure you put that on as well. Okay friends, all you have left to do now is go ahead and pump up the brakes and then take your truck for a road test down to your local alignment shop.